West Texas was a furnace in the summer of 1887. The sun hung in a white-hot sky like a branding iron. It didn't just shine, it punished the parched earth with a relentless, cruel intent in Tom Green County. The soil had long ago forgotten the cool, life-giving touch of rain. The ground was a map of jagged cracks. Sarah Thorne stood on her porch. Her silhouette was sharp against the blinding glare. She felt the heat radiating through the soles of her worn, cracked boots. She was only 32 years old. But the frontier had carved a lifetime of sorrow into the corners of her eyes. Her hands belonged to a true survivor. They were calloused, scarred, and permanently stained by the stubborn Texas earth. They were hands that knew the weight of a plow and the cold steel of a rifle. She wiped a bead of sweat from her temple with a tattered, salt-stained sleeve. Her gaze drifted to the small mound of stones on the hill. That was Thomas. That was her heart, buried under 6 feet of unforgiving limestone and dust. Her husband had been a man of iron and boundless hope. He believed a man could build a kingdom out of dust if he had enough grit in his soul. But the Texas frontier didn't care about a man's dreams. It didn't care about the sweat of his brow or the love in his heart. It only cared about what it could break. A deadly fever swept through the county during the brutal winter of 1885. It took Thomas before spring ever came. It happened so fast. One day he was hauling wood, his laughter echoing against the timber walls. The next, he was shivering under every blanket they owned. His skin burned like a prairie fire. By the third night, the light had left his eyes. Now, Sarah was the only thing standing between her daughter and the void. Inside the small, timber cabin, 6-year-old Maddie was humming a soft, lonely tune. The sound was the only music left in Sarah's hollow world. It was a fragile sound, like the wings of a moth beating against a glass pane. It was a sound that kept the creeping darkness at bay. Maddie was playing on the floor with a doll made of old flour sacks and scraps of yarn. The girl didn't know the well was nearly dry. She didn't know the bank was circling like a buzzard. Maddie's innocence was the last small flame in Sarah's world. Sarah protected it with every breath she took. She looked out at the shimmering, hazy horizon. The air vibrated like a violin string stretched to the breaking point. Dust devils danced across the fallow fields, spinning like ghosts of the harvest. This was the bitter aftermath of the big die-up. The winter of 1886 had been a nightmare of ice and howling winds. A white death had swept across the plains, burying the world in a frozen shroud. Thousands of cattle had piled up against the new barbed wire fences. The fences were meant to protect the land. Instead, they became a death trap for the innocent. The animals froze where they stood, huddling together for a warmth that never came. They were unable to drift south for shelter because of the wire. The ranching industry was in total ruins. Now, the drought of 1887 was finishing what the frost had started. The grass was gone, replaced by yellow stalks that crumbled into powder. The creeks were dry beds of cracked clay. They looked like bleached bones in the sun. Sarah felt the weight of the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It pressed against her ears until they rang with the sound of nothingness. It filled her lungs with a dry, metallic dread. Suddenly, a dark shape flickered near the rusted wire fence. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She squinted through the blinding glare, shielding her eyes with a shaking hand. It wasn't a stray calf. It was too tall for that. It was too lean, moving with a jagged, unnatural rhythm. The figure swayed like a reed in a gale. Though there was no wind, it stumbled. It nearly fell into the cactus. Then, it regained its balance with a desperate, agonizing effort. Sarah reached for the Winchester shotgun leaning against the doorframe. The cold iron felt familiar and solid in her grip. It was the only friend she had left in a world that wanted her gone. In the West, you didn't ask questions to the wind. You reached for your steel first. The figure came closer, dragging a heavy, crooked shadow across the yellow grass. It was a man. He looked like a creature made entirely of Texas dust and sun-bleached bone. He looked like he was held together by nothing but sheer will and rags. His boots were a disaster, the soles flapping like thirsty tongues. They were held together by bits of rusted wire and prayer. His clothes were so thin they were almost translucent. He carried a gnarled wooden staff. He used it to puncture the parched earth with every agonizing step. Sarah lowered the barrel slightly, her pulse slowing just a fraction. She could see his face now through the heat haze. He wasn't a predator searching for an easy victim. He wasn't a threat to her home. He was a tragedy in motion. The man stopped 10 yards from the porch. He looked up at her. His neck seemed almost too thin to support his head. His eyes seemed to contain the entire history of human suffering. They were clouded with age and the milky film of cataracts. They were clouded with a thirst that went deeper than his parched throat. He tried to speak, his jaw working like a rusted hinge. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His voice was a dry rattle in a hollow chest. Then, his knees simply gave way. He went down hard. His face hit the dirt with a dull, sickening thud. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dropped the Winchester on the porch boards. She ran into the burning yard, the heat of the soil biting through her boots. Danger never crossed her mind, neither did the fact that the water barrel was nearly empty. She only thought about the duty of one soul to another. This was the unwritten code of the frontier. You don't let a man die in the dirt like a dog. Maddie, get the bucket, she screamed toward the house. The heat rose from the ground in suffocating waves as she knelt. Sarah turned the man over as gently as she could. He was as light as a bundle of dried corn stalks. His skin was parched leather, stretched tight over a skull. It was mapped with the scars of a long, hard life. His lips were cracked and peeling. Maddie ran out of the house with a tin cup, her eyes wide with terror. Her small face was tight with a worry that no child should ever know. "Is he dead, Mama?" the girl whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah pressed her fingers to the man's neck. The world seemed to hold its breath for a heartbeat. The wind stopped its low moan. The birds in the scrub were silent. Then she felt it, a faint, rhythmic throb against her fingertips. A heartbeat. It was weak, like the flickering of a dying candle, but it was there. "No, baby." "But he's walking on the edge of the dark." Sarah lifted his head onto her lap. She didn't care about the filth covering his clothes. She didn't care about the smell of wood smoke and old, stale sweat. She poured a few drops of water onto his parched tongue. The man coughed. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering over cold stone. His eyes flickered open, blinking against the harsh light. They were a startling, piercing blue. They were the color of a mountain lake, deep and clear. He looked at her with a sudden, sharp clarity. For a second, the immense pain vanished from his expression. He looked relieved. He looked like a man grateful to see a human face before he surrendered to the dark. Thank you, he croaked. It was the sound of gravel being crushed under a heavy wagon wheel. "Hush now," Sarah said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "We've got you." Sarah and Maddie helped him to his feet, a slow and agonizing process. It was a heavy burden for a woman and a small child. But Sarah was built of frontier grit and iron. She was stronger than she looked. She was fueled by a stubborn refusal to let death take another guest. They dragged him into the thin, precious shade of the porch. The shade felt like a benediction from heaven itself. Sarah went inside and brought out a piece of dry cornbread. It was half of their dinner for the night. It was nearly all they had left in the barren larder. Sarah broke it in two, her hand steady but her heart heavy. She quietly kept the smaller piece for herself and prepared the rest. Sarah placed the cornbread on a small tin plate. Maddie took it carefully in both hands and stepped toward the stranger. Sarah extended one hand, silently assuring him that he was welcome. "Eat this, slowly," she commanded softly. The man took it with trembling, broken fingers that looked like bird claws. He savored every crumb as if it were a royal feast. He ate with a reverence that made Sarah's throat tighten. Maddie watched him with wide, curious eyes. She had never seen a man so hungry, yet so careful. "I'm Maddie," she said, breaking the heavy silence. She reached out and touched his tattered, dusty sleeve. The man managed a small, broken smile that transformed his face. It lit up his weathered features like a sunrise over a canyon. "I'm Silas," he whispered. Silas rested for 2 full days before he was strong enough to stand for long. Even then, Every movement seemed to cost him an immense effort. On the third morning, the sun rose like a ball of liquid fire. The heat returned to the valley with a vengeance. Silas was already awake when the first light hit the porch. He had cleaned the dirt from his face using a damp rag. He looked ancient, like a statue carved from the very hills. But he stood with a strange, quiet dignity that commanded respect. His back was as straight as a mountain ridge. He was slowly fixing the broken latch on the front gate. He stopped every few minutes to catch his breath, leaning against the wood. He had found some old, bent nails in the dirt. He was using a heavy stone as a makeshift hammer. He didn't ask for her permission. He didn't ask for any payment. He simply saw a hole in her world, and he tried to mend it with what little strength he had. Sarah walked out with 2 mugs of weak, bitter coffee. "You don't have to do that, Silas," she said, watching him work. He didn't look up from the latch, his focus absolute. "A man shouldn't eat bread he hasn't earned." Thorn. "You didn't eat much," she replied, her voice soft. "I ate enough to remember that I'm still a man." He finished the latch with one final, precise strike of the stone. He gave the gate a firm push. For the first time in 2 long years, it didn't creak. It swung perfectly on its hinges, smooth as silk. Sarah watched him, and her heart began to soften. He didn't move like a common drifter or a lost soul. He had the steady, rhythmic hands of a master craftsman. He had the observant eyes of a man who had seen too much of the world. That afternoon, Silas noticed a loose board beneath the porch steps. He knelt beside it and tested the rotting wood with his fingers. "This will give way before long," he said. Sarah looked at the board and then at the empty shed. "We have no new lumber." Silas studied the remains of an abandoned cattle pen near the dry creek. "Then we'll use what the land has already given us." He spent the afternoon pulling usable boards from the ruined pen. Maddie followed him with a small bucket. Collecting every nail, he carefully straightened against a stone. Sarah watched them from the doorway. For the first time since Thomas died, the yard carried the sound of someone building instead of something breaking. At sunset, Maddie climbed onto the repaired step and bounced twice. "It doesn't move, Mama," Silas smiled. "A good porch should hold a child without making her afraid." Maddie reached into her pocket and offered him a tiny piece of dried apple she had been saving. It had been wrapped so long that the paper clung to the candy. Silas accepted it as though she had handed him gold. "You saved this all that time." Maddie nodded. "I was waiting until there was someone to share it with." Silas turned his face toward the horizon. Sarah saw him blink several times before he answered. "Then I reckon this is the finest gift in all of Texas." He broke the dried apple in half again. He gave one piece back to Maddie. They sat together on the repaired porch and ate the tiny pieces slowly, making the small gift last as long as they could. Sarah looked away before either of them noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. As the days passed, Silas became the silent heartbeat of the farm. He chopped wood until the pile was neat and high. He hauled water from the shrinking well, gallon by gallon. He never uttered a single word of complaint about the heat or the work. Sarah looked toward the lonely grave on the hill as they sat on the porch one evening. Thomas used to say kindness was the only thing no drought could ever steal. Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on the setting sun. "Your husband was wiser than most men I've known in my time." In the long, purple evenings, he sat on the steps with Maddie. He told her stories of the Great Lakes in the far, cold north. He described water so vast you couldn't see the other side. He spoke of cities made of stone and shimmering glass that touched the clouds. "Have you been there?" Maddie asked, her eyes full of wonder. She rested her small head on his bony, tired knee. Silas looked at the darkening horizon, his expression unreadable. "A long time ago, child, in a life I barely recognize anymore." Maddie soon fell asleep with her head against Silas's knee. Sarah lifted the girl carefully and carried her inside. When she returned, Silas was still staring toward the north. "You speak of Chicago as if you left something buried there," Sarah said. Silas rubbed his thumb across the worn head of his wooden staff. "I left a wife there." Sarah remained silent. "Her name was Margaret," he continued. "She died while I was away negotiating a railroad contract. Elias was barely 20. He believed business mattered more to me than she did. Did it? Silas looked at Sarah. The question might have angered another man. Instead, it seemed to make him smaller. For too many years, I acted as if it did. He explained that Elias had inherited the company after Margaret's death. Father and son had worked beneath the same roof, but grief turned every conversation into an argument. Silas finally walked away, convinced his absence would free Elias from the bitterness between them. I told myself I was giving him peace, Silas said. The truth is, I was too ashamed to ask my own son to forgive me. Sarah looked toward Thomas's grave. Leaving doesn't make grief smaller. No, Silas replied. It only gives it more room to follow you. Sarah sat beside him. Their shoulders did not touch, but neither of them moved away. Thomas and I argued the morning before he became ill, she said. It was over a broken harness, something foolish. Silas waited. My last words to him were spoken in anger. Your last words were not your whole marriage, Sarah. She closed her eyes. No one had ever said that to her. The guilt she had carried for 2 years did not disappear, but for the first time, it loosened its grip. Sarah liked having him there. The shadows of the evening felt less threatening with his presence. The night felt less lonely with a man on the porch. But a different kind of darkness was approaching from the east. It arrived in a black carriage drawn by 2 sleek, expensive horses. The drought was a monster that killed slowly, but men were often more dangerous than nature ever could be. Arthur Sterling was a man made of cold ink and ledger lines. He was a man of even colder blood. He was a land agent working for the Gulf, Colorado and Santa Fe Railway. They were surveying a route toward San Angelo. He lived in a white mansion, surrounded by gardens. He lived far away from the dust and the killing heat. He didn't care about the people of the soil. He didn't care about the widows or the hungry orphans. He only cared about the cold profit of the iron rail. He wanted the riverfront properties, even if the rivers were dry. The railroad was moving west like an unstoppable machine. Sterling stepped out of the carriage with a practiced grace. He wore a suit of fine black wool that looked untouched by the dust. His boots were polished to a mirror shine that mocked the dirt. He looked at the dusty yard with a sneer of pure disgust. He held a silk handkerchief to his nose. He wanted to block the scent of poverty and struggle. Mrs. Thorne, he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. His voice was like a sharpened blade hidden in velvet. Mr. Sterling, Sarah replied, standing tall on the porch. She stood her ground, her chin held high. Silas stood behind her in the doorway, silent and imposing. The bank is concerned about your situation, Sterling began. The bank is always concerned when it sees a chance to steal. Sarah snapped. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, fierce fire. Your husband's debts were significant, Sarah. He took loans to save the herd during the freeze, she said. He died trying to pay every cent of them back. Sterling smiled, a cold, predatory expression. The cattle died anyway, Mrs. Thorne. The money is gone into the wind. This land is nothing but a graveyard now. It's my home, she said, her voice sounding like struck flint. Thomas is buried on that hill. I won't leave him there alone in the dark. Sterling sighed with a fake, oily pity that made Sarah sick. I can offer you a small sum out of the goodness of the company. You can move to the city where there is work. I'm not leaving this land, Sarah repeated, her voice low and steady. Sterling's eyes turned to cold, hard glass. The law follows the paper, Mrs. Thorne. It does not follow the heart or the memories of the dead. He looked past her at Silas, his lip curling. Who is this vagabond? Another mouth you can't afford to feed with your empty jars. Silas stepped forward out of the shadows. He looked like a mountain of weathered granite in the fading light. I'm a guest, Silas said, his voice booming across the yard. It was a voice that commanded the very air to be still. Sterling laughed, an ugly, jagged sound. A guest in rags. How poetic and pathetic. He turned back to Sarah with a final, cruel sneer. You have 30 days to pay $80 in full. That is the final notice from the court. If the money isn't in San Angelo by then, the sheriff will come. He will move your crates to the road. The carriage kicked up a cloud of bitter dust as it sped away. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been punched. $80 in 1887 was an impossible fortune for a widow. It was a mountain she could never hope to climb. She went to the kitchen and sat at the wooden table. She poured the coins from her jar onto the scarred wood. The sound of the clinking metal felt like a funeral knell. $5.40. She sat there for a long time in the silence. Her hands were shaking, visible in the dim light. Everything they had worked for was vanishing like smoke. The dreams were blowing away in the relentless wind. Silas walked in and sat across from her. "He's a small man with a big shadow," Silas said quietly. "He has the law on his side, Dad," Sarah replied, looking at the coins. "Power is like the wind, Sarah. It can shift in an instant without warning." "How can it shift for me?" she asked. "I have nothing left to sell to the world." She looked down at her gold wedding band on her finger. It was thin and worn from years of hard labor. It was the last physical piece of her old life with Thomas. "I'll sell the ring," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No," Silas said firmly, his eyes burning with conviction. "That belongs to your heart and your history. Keep it where it belongs." The following morning, Sarah carried Thomas's old account ledger to the table. Its leather cover was cracked and darkened by years of use. She opened it beside Silas. Every loan payment was recorded in Thomas's careful handwriting. Every calf sold, every sack of grain purchased, and every dollar delivered to the bank had been written down. Silas studied the pages for nearly an hour. "This figure doesn't match Sterling's notice," he said. Sarah leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "Thomas recorded a payment of $12 in October of 1885. Silas tapped the page. "Sterling's papers do not credit it." Sarah remembered the day clearly. Thomas had ridden to San Angelo in the rain and returned after dark. He had been proud because the payment put them ahead of schedule. Could the bank have lost the record? Silas's expression hardened. "To us, banks lose papers. Men like Sterling sometimes help them disappear." For a moment, Sarah felt a spark of hope. "If we prove it, can we stop him? It may reduce the debt." Silas closed the ledger gently. "But it will not erase what remains." Sarah pressed the book against her chest. Thomas had not left her only debts. He had left evidence that he had fought until the end. That afternoon, she wrapped the ledger in cloth and hid it beneath a loose floorboard. She would not allow Sterling to take the last proof of her husband's honor. Maddie watched her replace the board. "Is that Papa's book?" Sarah nodded. "Then we have to keep it safe." "We do." Maddie placed her flour sack doll on top of the floorboard. "She'll guard it." Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead. For one brief moment, the impossible mountain before them seemed a little less steep. That night, Sarah couldn't find peace in sleep. She went to the old cedar trunk in the dark corner. She pulled out a heavy wool blanket, thick and warm. It was a family heirloom from her grandmother. The pattern was intricate and beautiful. It was a link to a time before the dust had taken her soul. She walked 10 miles to the trading post the next morning. The heat was a physical weight on her weary shoulders. The sun was a hammer striking the anvil of the earth. Miller, the store owner, felt the wool with tired, calloused fingers. "It's the finest work I've seen in 10 years, Sarah." "How much?" she asked, her heart racing in her chest. $2, Miller said, looking at the floor. He couldn't meet her desperate eyes. Sarah felt a sharp stab of pain in her chest. $2. It's worth 20 in any city in the East. Not today, Sarah. Miller sighed. People need flour and lard to stay alive. Sarah took the $2, her heart feeling like lead. She bought a small sack of grain for the horse. She bought one small piece of peppermint for Maddie. It was the only sweetness she could afford. She walked home feeling lighter in body, but it was the worst possible kind of light. She was trading her history for a few more days of survival. When she arrived home, she found Silas collapsed on the porch. The heat had finally broken his fragile, aged frame. He was coughing, a deep, wet sound that terrified her. Sarah panicked. She couldn't lose him too. He was the only one who truly saw her. She spent 3 days and 3 nights nursing him. She used her last drops of cool water for his burning brow. In his fever, Silas spoke of a son he had lost. He called out for a name, Elias. "I'm sorry, Elias," he muttered into the pillow. The weight was too much to carry alone for so long. Sarah held his hand through the long, dark hours. She whispered comfort into the shadows of the room. "It's okay, Silas. He will understand." On the fourth day, the fever finally broke like a storm. Silas opened his eyes and saw the world again. He found Sarah mending his coat by the window light. She looked exhausted, her eyes sunken. "Why do you care for a ghost like me?" he asked. "Because you're here," she said simply. "In this house, we don't turn away the weary or the broken." Silas touched her hand with his palm. It was cool and steady now. "You have a rare soul, Sarah Thorne. I'm just trying to survive the day. Silas." The deadline was a ticking clock in her head. 20 days left until the sheriff arrived. The jar on the shelf was still almost empty of hope. She took in laundry from a railroad survey camp 5 miles to the south. She scrubbed denim until her knuckles bled and cracked. The soapy water in the tub turned a pale, sickly pink. She made $3 more over a week of labor. On the final evening at the survey camp, the foreman handed Sarah her coins and glanced at her swollen hands. "You shouldn't come back tomorrow," he said. "There's a fever moving through the tents." Sarah closed her fingers around the money. "I need the work." "You have a child at home." His warning stopped her. Sarah remembered Thomas beneath the blankets and the terrible heat of his skin. She thanked the foreman and began the 5-mile walk home. Halfway across the open country, a dust storm rose without warning. The northern sky turned brown. Wind struck the plain with enough force to bend the mesquite trees. Sarah wrapped her apron across her mouth and pushed forward. The coins were tied securely inside her dress. She could not afford to lose a single one. Through the wall of dust, she heard a horse crying in panic. She found an overturned surf cart beside the road. A young worker was trapped beneath one wheel. Sarah could not lift the cart alone. She used a fallen fence post as a lever and pushed until her arms shook. The wheel rose just enough for the man to crawl free. He offered her a silver dollar for saving him. Sarah looked at the coin. It represented flour, coffee, and perhaps another week on the land. Then she saw the blood soaking through his torn sleeve. "Keep it," she said. "You may need a doctor." The worker stared at her. "Lady, aren't you the widow losing her ranch?" Sarah tightened the cloth around his arm. "I haven't lost it yet." When she finally reached home, Silas was waiting beside the gate with a lantern. Maddie ran into the storm and wrapped both arms around Sarah's waist. Silas saw the bruises forming across Sarah's hands. "You gave away another chance to help yourself," he said softly. "I couldn't take money from an injured boy." Silas nodded. "That is exactly why men like Sterling will never understand you." Sarah had almost nothing left. Yet she still chose kindness over profit. Would you have made the same choice? Tell us in the comments. One evening, Silas asked for a pencil. He asked for a scrap of paper, his eyes intense. "There's an old business associate in Chicago," Silas said quietly. "If he's still alive, he'll know how to find my son." He sat by the dying lamp on the table. He wrote with an elegant, looping script. It was the writing of an educated, powerful man. "Take this to the telegraph office in town," he said. "Silas, a telegraph costs $1.50, so trust me, Sarah, use the coffee money." His blue eyes were steady and full of absolute certainty. Sarah walked the 10 miles again the next day. The operator looked at the message on the paper. His eyes went wide and he let out a sharp gasp. "This is going to Chicago." "To the Vance headquarters." "Yes, Sarah said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She handed over her last precious coins. She said a silent prayer as the machine began to click. She walked home as the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The deadline was now only 10 days away. She had no money for the bank. She had no hope left in her heart. But Maddie was waiting on the porch steps for her. She had a small, brave smile on her face. And Silas was there, standing tall again. He was watching the dusty road like a silent sentry. The next 9 days passed without an answer. Each morning, Silas walked to the gate before sunrise. Each evening, he returned to the porch without speaking. Sarah never asked what he expected to see. She already knew. On the 28th day, a rider from town finally appeared. He carried a folded telegram inside his coat. Sarah's heart leaped when he called Silas's name. Silas unfolded the message. His eyes moved across the few short lines, then his shoulders sank. "What does it say?" Sarah asked. "The Chicago office received my message." Silas folded the paper slowly. But Elias was already traveling in the east. They don't know when he will return. Sarah turned toward the house so Maddie would not see her face. 2 days remained. Their last hope was somewhere beyond the horizon and might never know they needed him. That night, Maddie found Sarah sitting beside Thomas's grave. The girl climbed into her mother's lap. "Are we going to lose our house?" Sarah wanted to promise that everything would be all right, but she had never lied to her child. "I don't know, baby." Maddie looked toward the cabin. "Will Papa know where to find us if we leave?" The question broke through the last wall around Sarah's heart. She held her daughter close and wept into her hair. Silas approached but did not offer empty reassurance. He sat beside them on the dry ground. "If Elias does not come," he said, "I will go with you wherever you must go." Sarah looked at the frail old man. "You don't owe us that." "I know." Silas placed his hand over the dry earth covering Thomas. "A family isn't always made by blood or by a name written in a Bible. Sometimes it begins when people choose not to abandon one another." Maddie reached for his hand. "Then you're already family." Silas bowed his head in the darkness. Sarah heard him quietly begin to cry. On the 30th day, the black carriage returned. Sterling brought the sheriff with him this time. He brought a crew of rough men in heavy wagons. They were ready to strip the house bare of its life. "Time is up, Sarah Thorne," Sterling shouted from the road. Sarah stood on the porch, her back straight. She held Maddie close to her side, shielding her. "Please don't take our home," the child cried out. Sterling ignored the girl's plea entirely. He looked at the sheriff with a cold nod. "I'm sorry, Sarah," the sheriff said, his face red with shame. "I have to follow the legal order of the court." Suddenly, a low rumble vibrated through the parched ground. It wasn't the sound of thunder from the sky. It was the rhythmic sound of galloping horses. A massive cloud of dust appeared on the San Angelo Road. A luxury Concord stagecoach tore across the open plain. Elias had traveled by rail as far as the existing line allowed. Then he had driven through the night to reach the ranch before the deadline. The coach lurched to a stop in the yard. A young man stepped out of the coach. He was dressed in a suit of fine black silk. A gold watch chain glittered against his silk vest. He looked at the crying child on the porch. Then, his eyes found the old man in rags. "Father," he whispered, his voice breaking with raw emotion. Silas stood up, his dignity returning in full. He let his wooden staff fall to the dirt. "Hello, Elias, you found me at last." The young man ran forward across the yard. He threw his arms around the old drifter. Sterling's jaw dropped in genuine shock. "Mr. Vance," he stammered, his voice trembling. The Vance family owned one of the largest railroad companies in the country. "My name is Elias Vance," the man said, turning to the crowd. He looked at Sarah with profound respect. "And I just received a message from a saint." He looked at the papers in Sterling's shaking hand. "My attorneys purchased Mrs. Thorne's mortgage 3 days ago," Elias said. "Her debt now belongs to my family." He looked directly at Sterling. "And your employers have accepted my offer to take control of their local holdings. Your authority here ended this morning. Leave this property now before I ask the sheriff to remove you for trespassing." The silence on the Texas plain was absolute. Sterling lowered his eyes and returned to his carriage without another word. Elias turned to Sarah and removed his silk hat. "Mrs. Thorne, you saved my father's life." "He saved mine too, she whispered, leaning on the wall. "You gave him bread when he was a stranger," Elias said. "Now, let me give you back your world." I handed her a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was the title to the land, signed and sealed. "The debt is paid 10,000 times over," Elias said. Sarah wept. the tears carving paths through the dust on her face. It was pure, holy relief. "Are you leaving us, though?" she asked Silas, her voice small. Silas looked at the porch where he had been reborn. "I have a mansion in Chicago," he said, looking at the hills. "But the air in Texas finally feels like home." Elias looked at Sarah and saw the strength in her spirit. "We're going to build a real ranch here," Elias said, "with a deep well strong enough to carry this ranch through the dry seasons. We will make this desert bloom for you." Maddie was already holding Elias's hand. She slipped her tiny hand into Silas's weathered one as well. "Now nobody has to be alone anymore," she whispered. "I think we have plenty of room," Sarah said. A real smile finally touched her lips and stayed there. Elias remained beside her after the others walked toward the house. "I hope I haven't spoken too boldly," he said. "This is still your land." Sarah looked at the envelope in her hands. "For 2 years, everyone who came here wanted to take something. You are the first man who arrived wanting to give it back." Elias glanced toward Silas and Maddie. "My father sounds happier with your daughter than he ever did in a Chicago drawing room. Maddie has a way of making lonely people feel useful. She learned that from her mother." Sarah lowered her eyes. The compliment did not feel polished or rehearsed. It felt honest. Elias removed his coat and placed it over the porch rail. "I may not know how to mend a gate with a stone, but I know men who can drill a well." Sarah smiled. "That sounds useful enough." Their eyes met for a quiet moment. Neither of them named what was beginning. There was no need. Some promises were better allowed to grow slowly. Like green grass after a long season of drought, that evening, they sat together on the porch like a family. The sun began to set behind the limestone hills. The sun didn't feel like a hammer anymore. It felt like a blessing on the new day. Before dawn, heavy clouds rolled across the Texas sky. Just as the first light appeared, gentle rain finally began to fall. Sarah closed her eyes and stepped off the porch. She listened to the rhythmic song of the rain on the roof. It was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. The long season of dust was ending. Something new was beginning. The West had tested her. It had taken almost everything, but it could never take the kindness in her heart. That was the home she had been fighting for all along. If this story reminded you that kindness is never wasted, please share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe for more stories from the American frontier.